30 years ago today, at 4:30 in the morning, the Northridge earthquake shook Southern California. A 6.7 quake devastated a huge part of our area, killing dozens of people and damaging thousands of buildings. Good evening, everyone. You are watching KCAL News at 5 on CBS Los Angeles. I'm Pat Harvey.
And thanks for joining us today. I'm Chauncey Glover. And tonight we are looking back on the Northridge quake at some of the lessons learned and also what's changed since 1994.
Well, we begin with KCAL's Jasmine Veal, who visited the epicenter and spoke with people remembering that fateful day 3 decades ago.
Brent Stelly survived the California earthquake.
Brent Peskin was 29 years old when the Northridge earthquake hit 30 years ago. A t-shirt and some photographs hang on the wall inside his family's restaurant that had some minor damage.
Behind the counter, everything just went onto the floor.
The then and now, from the front door looking in and behind the deli counter. He says he didn't know how bad the damage was to this area until he drove into work.
I got here and it was like a war zone. Driving here, it looked like a war zone. You know, everybody's brick wall was laying on the ground. It was bad.
Among the lunch crowd Wednesday was Bruce Lang, who remembers that day well and still lives just miles from the epicenter.
It shook us pretty good.
He says luckily his wife had an earthquake kit.
Within a half an hour, she had a tent on the front yard, and we put our 3 kids in there and set up camp.
I'm here on Reseda Boulevard, and these are the Park Ridge apartments. But 30 years ago, this is where the largest number of people died in one place. 16 people were killed at the Northridge Meadows complex when this 3-story building collapsed.
Because it just pancaked. So it went from a 3-story building to a 2-story. So as you're driving, it just looked fine. But then I drove by Seaside, that was gone.
All 53 were either damaged or destroyed. There were no laboratories, there were no classrooms, there were no offices.
Cal State Northridge Marketing Director Carmen Chandler showed us the campus map sent to students after the earthquake.
So what they built were lawns, and on these lawns, more than 300 trailers.
She was a reporter at the LA Daily News, living in Studio City at the time.
It sounded like every freight train in the country was heading towards your house, your bedroom. Anytime a truck goes through, I wake up. It's been 30 years, but it's that sound.
People still haunted by the memories of that earthquake that changed so many lives. In Northridge, Jasmine Veal, KCAL News.
Well, so much has changed over the last 30 years, especially when it comes to technology and preparing for earthquakes.
We spoke to seismologist Dr. Lucy Jones, who was a part of the team that responded to the quake, about the advances we've made since.
In terms of what I do as a seismologist, it's a night and day difference. We didn't even see the first aftershock for 2 hours because we had such old computers. Now, of course, everything's there just immediately, and information helps people cope.
Now, when the earthquake struck 30 years ago, LA City firefighters were among the first on the scene rescuing people trapped in collapsed buildings and other structures. This morning in Sherman Oaks, firefighters from the front lines that day reunited to reminisce about the hours-long rescue effort to save a street sweeper trapped in a collapsed parking structure.
Our task was to basically dig down to him. Once we got down to him, now we had to lift up the concrete, which is, I believe, was 3 parking structures of concrete. Once we got that lifted up, then we had the task of extricating him out of it. And that was probably the most vivid moment that I can remember, is getting him out and bringing him up on the gurney, and thank God that he was still alive.
Now, the department also showed off new techniques they developed that they say will help them get to and rescue survivors quickly. And I remember that day and time 30 years ago. I was asleep, obviously, and I remember waking up to something that did sound like a freight train and saw my heavy furniture just bobbing up and down like they were Legos or something. And I remember panicking, not having a cell phone at the time, but I did have an analog phone, called the station and told them that I couldn't get out because I had no power and the garage door wouldn't open. And they sent a photographer, I believe it was Jeff Nails, to pick me up. Went straight to work with my 8-year-old daughter at the time. And I'm not sure how long I was on the air, but the coverage was devastating. Seeing part of the 10 freeway actually just collapse was just something that I'll never forget. But here we are.
And it's good to see the advances they've made since
Absolutely.
then. Yeah. And I've never lived through her.
And I hope you don't have to.
Me too. And our coverage.
I remember rushing in, getting here about 5:15 in the morning, and speeding down the 134 freeway. Only when I got here did I realize that some of the freeways had collapsed. I remember these pictures, search and rescue, going through and looking for people. Entire apartment buildings had collapsed. They had subterranean garages, and the buildings had collapsed on the garage. I also remember I had a 9-month-old infant at the time, and I remember jumping out of the bed. I was jolted, jumped out of bed, and fell down. It shook so hard I couldn't get my balance, but I remember running down the hall to find out if he was okay. 9 months old. And I remember how terrified people were because the aftershocks
just kept coming and
coming, and they were so great. And I remember people saying, "What are you doing? Can I come stay with you?" And I had people staying with me. I remember Santa Clarita. They didn't have water. They didn't have power. You know, gas was turned off. It was terrifying for several days before things finally got back to normal and they were able to figure out the magnitude of the damage here.
I remember just trying to get to the kitchen. That was challenging in itself. Trying to go to the bathroom, little things that we take for granted.
Did you have damage? You were young, so.
Right, we didn't have, luckily our home didn't get damaged, but we had, I mean, the cabinets were just, you know, the doors were flung open and everything had fallen out. The refrigerator, I remember, had tipped over. I mean, so many things. Furniture had toppled over, just broken glass everywhere in the house.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. We look at these pictures and the memories flood back. The freeways, I think that was the thing that was perhaps the most terrifying. When the sun came up, you would see that entire freeways had pancaked. The 10 freeway, the interchange up near the New Hall Pass. It was just shocking to see. And I remember the CHP officer who lost his life on a motorcycle. I believe it was CHP. It was a law enforcement officer who was coming in on a motorcycle, lost his life. So many people remember exactly where they were that morning. NBC4's Alex Rosier joins us live from Reseda right now with more recollections. You know, Reseda is so close to Northridge. They really felt the brunt of that quake.
Colleen, you may remember, we're actually right in front of the Park Ridge Apartments right now, but in 1994, this complex was not here. The complex that used to stand here was seriously damaged, and 16 people died here when that Northridge earthquake hit, and that's just one of many stories from this very dark day.
The video is unforgettable. The Northridge earthquake is a memory forever etched in the minds of millions.
I was 11, and it was 2 weeks before my 12th birthday.
We spoke with Jillian Gordon, Gene O'Sullivan.
I was a grad student in English, creative writing at Cal State Northridge.
And Cynthia Rodwich.
I was many things at CSUN, but I was chair of the journalism department.
All three of these women have different memories from that day. Jillian was in the 6th grade when the quake hit her home in Van Nuys at 4:30 in the morning.
And we'd always been told that, like, you know, the big one could come and happen. And I think when that happened that night, in my head as an 11-year-old, I was like, this is the big one.
The moment it happened, I woke up in the air above my bed screaming.
In other earthquakes, it stops pretty quickly, and so, you know, it's 15 seconds, it's 20 seconds, and this thing went on and on. And I turned to my husband, I said, if this is not immediately under our house, then someplace has been destroyed.
Considering what the scope of that was, I think we were incredibly lucky. You know, all of our damage was pretty superficial, you know, a couple cracks and things like that on the wall, but all superficial, not structural.
You could hear the pool sloshing, you could hear something crashing, which we later found out was the chimney coming down in the backyard.
Friends of mine who were displaced from their homes, the fires, there was, you know, our local mall was completely wrecked. We were all kind of, I think, in shock at that moment, but again, a major sense of community.
It was really an amazing collaboration of recovery. You know, people just got back to work and we just did it.
I think that this really spurred a greater desire to make sure that we do have at least some technology to know even moments before an earthquake happens. And the great thing about Southern California is we have beautiful weather and it's lovely. We also have earthquakes, and we kind of need to always keep that in the back of our mind and just be prepared.
And I think that's what a lot of people are thinking of on this 30th anniversary, being prepared and having those earthquake safety kits ready, just in case another big one like Northridge hits Southern California. Reporting live in Reseda, I'm Alex Rozier, NBC4 News.
Alex, thank you for that. We'll be looking back at the Northridge.
It has been 30 years since the deadly and destructive 6.7 Northridge earthquake jolted millions of people awake at 4:30 in the morning and forever changed the face of Los Angeles. 57 people were killed, some 9,000 were injured, and the quake caused up to $20 billion in property damage. KTLA's Lauren Lister takes a look back at the devastation and a day that marked the beginning of a new era in Los Angeles.
We have had a very, very powerful earthquake that first struck at about 4:31 this morning, lasted for at least 30 seconds.
KTLA broadcasting live in the aftermath of the deadly and destructive 6.7 magnitude 1994 Northridge earthquake.
Everything is going really big.
This is the biggest.
See if you can get a shot of that. Move up there, get a view of those lights.
Buildings were flattened.
A huge townhouse complex, 40 to 50 units, and devastated by the quake.
Some freeways caving in.
That highway just literally collapsed.
This is in the Sylmar area.
We've been told that there are people trapped inside their cars.
People scrambling to get essentials with key services cut off.
They have no water in their homes, no gas, no electricity, and they're basically standing in line here in order to buy a few supplies.
30 years later, some who survived the Temblor remember it clearly.
The first thing I remember, and I have never forgotten this, is the sound. It sounded like every freight train in the country was heading towards my bedroom.
Then came the shaking.
And it was a violent shaking. It was so violent it knocked me out of the bed.
Carmen Ramos-Chandler was living in Studio City at the time, also a newspaper reporter tasked with covering the story that day. She now works at Cal State Northridge, which saw every building damaged on their campus.
This was the worst natural disaster to hit a public university in the history of the United States until Katrina.
LA City Fire Department today remembering their response, including to a Northridge apartment complex.
The Northridge Meadows apartment complex, where there have been heavy casualties and fatalities.
Second floor windows to bedrooms were now lined up with first floor windows.
We've made some pretty significant improvements in the building codes, and perhaps even more importantly, have had some major retrofitting efforts.
Lauren Lister, KTLA 5 News.
Coming up here at 10.
Colleen Sullivan, this is a special edition of Eyewitness News at 10.
I'm Mark Brown. We are live right now on ABC7, Hulu, and wherever you stream. It was 30 years ago today, Southern California was rocked by the Northridge earthquake. Since then, a lot of work has been done to try to minimize the damage from the next big quake, but there's still a lot to do.
Christian Cordero reports.
Everyone of a certain age remembers where they were 30 years ago today. But the truth is, seismologist Dr. Lucy Jones doesn't remember much.
It was so overwhelming. I've got sort of vignettes. I can remember doing some press conferences. I remember my husband getting back into town and jumping into work.
Dr. Jones was today's keynote speaker at a symposium commemorating the Northridge earthquake anniversary. As one of the leading voices behind earthquake science, when she speaks, people listen. So when asked about how prepared we are for the next one, Dr. Jones doesn't mince words.
It's up to you. Is the bookcase going to fall on you? Are you going to lose your grandmother's china because you put it out on display in a way that isn't hooked down?
The 6.7 Northridge quake happened at 4:30 a.m. Freeways collapsed, fires started, at least 57 people died. The recovery that took years and cost billions led to new buildings and old, reinforced with tough lessons learned.
We have come very far, at least from being able to avoid the same type of collapses that have happened at Northridge Meadows apartment.
Structural engineer Maria Mohammed used the Northridge Meadows apartment as an example of a vulnerable building. The soft-story complex collapsed from 3 levels to 2 during the quake. LA has since required the retrofit of several types of buildings, including ones like this. Both experts we spoke with today urge homeowners consult with a structural engineer for personal guidance, all to make sure the buildings stand in the next one. But then what?
Say we want buildings we can use after the earthquake. Right now, our building code's solely saying, let's make sure you crawl out alive.
Scientists are now pushing for policy that would better the odds of you walking back into a building with all of its necessary parts intact.
Like the air conditioning, the electrical, the plumbing, those components being functional is important for the occupants of the building to continue to reside in it, to continue to work in it.
Of course, in '94, the power went out, phone lines went down. Even with advancements of technology, it's easy to see how many of those challenges would still be true today. And one of the big themes for today was that it shouldn't take another really big one for us to see how prepared we are for the next one. Even buying an extra case of water, Dr. Jones says, is a good start. In Pasadena, I'm Cristiano Cordero, ABC 7 Eyewitness News.
The Northridge quake anniversary should serve as a reminder to be prepared for the next disaster. We've compiled resources to help you get a kit, make a plan, and be informed. Just go to abc7.com/preparesocal.
Friends,
30 years ago today, you might remember a magnitude 6.7 earthquake rocked Southern California. The powerful quake struck at 4:30 a.m. These 57 people were killed. Nearly 12,000 people were treated for injuries at hospitals. More than 114,000 buildings were damaged and property losses totaled $40 billion.
If you lived here, you do not forget that day. Valuable lessons were learned in the aftermath of the deadly and costly natural disaster. And now there are even some earthquake early warning systems.
And first responders have new safety tools. Fox 11's Christina Gonzalez got a first-hand look.
I worked for KTTV during the Northridge quake. One of my most searing memories is helping firefighters with our camera lights as they searched for people under the rubble. We spoke to some of those firefighters again today.
It was just victim after victim after victim.
Retired LA City firefighter Mike Henry remembers the Northridge quake. That used to be a third floor. The Meadows apartment complex, which collapsed, killing 16 people.
What's left of the first floor is now about 2.5 feet high.
Second floor windows to bedrooms were now lined up with first floor windows to bedrooms.
The damage was overwhelming, as were heroic efforts to save people. Everybody's trying to crawl under the building, as you see, and they're screaming and they're trying to see if they hear anybody down here.
We had to lift up the concrete, which I believe was 3 parking structures of concrete.
At the Northridge Mall to find a father of 5 who was operating a street sweeper in the parking structure when the quake hit.
And that was probably the most vivid moment that I can remember, is getting him out and bringing him up on the gurney, and thank God that he was still alive.
But at least 57 people died on January 17th of 1994. 30 years to the day, LAFD shows us modern equipment that's making a difference in rescues.
We have a 360 camera. It transmits a signal over to an iPad and an instant commander.
So you'll see here that camera that's going to go in there. We can actually move that camera and control it right from here.
One of the things that is very different from when the Northridge quake happened is this. Back then, the search and rescue teams were at an infancy in this city. Now they're full-blown, and you can see them practicing how to get somebody from a collapsed freeway, which happened back then.
The 5, that's what this has fallen onto.
The 5 freeway, where it connected with the 14, collapsed.
We only have 1 fatality if that freeway collapsed.
Today, more powerful and effective tools are part of the LAFD arsenal. Still, the most important lesson?
We've had a few earthquakes here in the last couple weeks. So if you're not prepared right now, you better get prepared, because it's going to come again. That's for sure.
If you want to find out more about how to be ready, LAFD.org has great resources, so does FoxLA.com. I'm Christina Gonzalez, Fox 11 News.